stakeholders. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I was hoping to make this presentation in Labrador. However, because of my requirement to be in the House of Commons, it was not possible. So I am pleased to bring the concerns and interests of my constituents of Labrador to your session here in St. John's. I am Yvonne Jones, the Member of Parliament for Labrador. I represent the 30,000 residents of Labrador, the landmass of nearly 300,000 square kilometers, the most northern region of our province, and the communities that are directly adjacent to shrimp fishing areas 4, 5, and 6. I want to thank you for the work that you are doing as part of the MAP and for agreeing to hold 2 consultation sessions in Labrador, in Mary's Harbour and in Goose Bay, and for scheduling a site visit to Charlottetown, home of the one shrimp processing facility in Labrador. Leading up to these panel consultations, I've had many discussions with owner-operators, fishers, quota holders, both inshore and offshore, processing companies, Aboriginal governments, and community members across Labrador. Those discussions were focused on sharing of resource, the policy of last in, first out, stock status assessments, and Labrador's place in the industry. It was obvious that there are groups in Labrador that stand to gain from eliminating the last in, first out policy, and others that will benefit from keeping it in place. I feel the industry should be governed on principles and not on policy, and that is the perspective that is shared by my constituents. So while most people will either argue for LIFO or argue against it, we see it as just a policy that serves the interests of some. We strongly urge the panel to look at establishing principles of resource allocation, principles that are based on fairness and balance to those involved. Labrador has been left behind in the fair allocation of fish resources off our shores. We believe that 2 principles should guide the decisions around fish resource allocation in Canada and therefore in Labrador, in this case, shrimp. The first being Aboriginal land and water rights, the second being the principle of adjacency, as others have provided a supportive position on adjacency already. The northern and southern coast of Labrador has century-old dependency on the fishery. From the first processing in the late 1600s until today, it is the one industry that employs and sustains the region's coastal communities. Today, Labrador has 6 full-time seasonal fish processing facilities, along with a number of landing and holding facilities. All of these plants have been modernized and continues to operate because of the lucrative revenues of shrimp. The cash subsidy of offshore shrimp goes to subsidize all coastal communities, from the Labrador Shrimp Company and Torngat Fisheries, combined with inshore shrimp enterprises. They have created good jobs, strong businesses, and stable communities. The story of the shrimp industry in Labrador is a bitter and sweet story of how a rural, remote, northern Aboriginal region of Canada survived after the cod disappeared from our shores. The offshore allocations of shrimp to the Labrador Shrimp Company generated the revenues needed to build processing facilities, to increase the capacity of fishermen, to modernize facilities, create jobs, and grow communities. Torngat Fisheries followed a similar model. There was no pocketing of millions on the backs of Labrador people or a Labrador resource. Everything was reinvested back into our communities. For those who think the fishing industry in Newfoundland and Labrador is not a social industry, then you need to change your lens, because it is just that. Without a fishery, those very communities in my riding could not survive. If the Government of Canada had given all our offshore allocations to outside interests 40 years ago, then we would not exist and be a thriving region that we are today. In modernizing how we move forward in Canada, we also have to modernize our thinking to maximize our benefit. I was going to prepare a big PowerPoint presentation, but I think most of what I have to say can be summed up in just one image. It is the map. As you can see, Labrador is directly adjacent to shrimp fishing areas 4 and 5 and most of 6. Yet Labrador accounts for less than 14% of the inshore quota allocations. Further, Labrador still holds less than 27% of offshore shrimp resources in Labrador. Aboriginal interests hold only special allocations of the resource that is adjacent to their land claim areas. Labrador offshore and inshore combined access 14% of the overall quota in Area 6, yet we are adjacent to 50% of Area 6 and 100% of shrimp fishing areas 4 and 5. Inshore enterprises in the Northern Gulf hold more shrimp in Area 6 as non-adjacent interests than the Labrador inshore sector. So while offshore industry outside of the province holds 3 times the quota allocation of our adjacent inshore enterprises in Area 6, Labrador offshore and inshore, as I said, combined access less than 14% of the overall quota in that same area, Area 6. Yet we are 50% adjacent, and we have Aboriginal inherent rights in the marine jurisdiction. Yet Labradorians hold no quotas for any species in any other jurisdiction in or adjacent areas. Let's look at the fisheries across Atlantic Canada, for instance. There is no cross-jurisdiction of fish resource allocation like we have in Labrador. In Prince Edward Island, oysters are harvested by the enterprises in Prince Edward Island. In New Brunswick, crab is harvested by enterprises in New Brunswick. In Nova Scotia, lobster is harvested by enterprises in Nova Scotia. In 3PS, redfish is harvested in the adjacent area. Gulf shrimp is allocated to Gulf region enterprises at 100%, and so on. However, Labrador shrimp is allocated to every province in Atlantic Canada and Quebec and most all regions of Newfoundland. The last people to access shrimp were Labradorians and Labrador Aboriginal interests. Past policies of DFO have tended to serve interest groups, lobbyists, unions, and political friends of the government. They are designed to meet the want at the end of the day and provides for some non-substantive political argument to back up the minister or the bureaucracy, and this has to change. Therefore, a principle-governed industry based on science is a fair process, and the 2 strongest principles founded on fairness are, as I've already stated, Aboriginal rights and adjacency. I'm sure this panel will hear, particularly in Nunavut, the importance of adjacency as a principle for all resource development decisions. Right here in Newfoundland, there are those making the case for adjacency, and I find it unfortunate that oftentimes adjacency is used by the province in making a case to the federal government, but that principle is not always applied within our own province, and we've seen that in the past. I want to refer to the map again, the map of Labrador that I gave you. The red, green, and yellow areas on the map are Aboriginal land claim areas. The blue is the Torngat National Park, which is shared by Nunatsiavut and Nunavik. The red is the settled Nunatsiavut land claim, including a marine area that overlaps and is adjacent to shrimp fishing area 4 and 5. The green area is the Innu Nation land claim that is in the final agreement stage and again is adjacent to shrimp fishing area 5. The yellow area is the Nunatuavut land claim, which is in the process of being accepted for discussion and negotiation by the federal government, and again is adjacent to and overlaps shrimp fishing areas 5 and 6. Consecutive previous federal governments recognized the value and the importance of adjacent Aboriginal rights to adjacent resources and using them to promote local and regional economic development. Our federal government is committed to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and to restoring a nation-to-nation, Crown-to-Inuit relationship with Indigenous people. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People looks at the rights of adjacent Aboriginal government. It looks at fair resource sharing and providing for stable economic growth. Not only do the 3 Aboriginal governments in Labrador or their economic development arms have special allocations for northern shrimp, but so do beneficiaries or members and member-owned companies. The economic stability for Aboriginal communities and individual enterprises is directly tied to the shrimp fishing industry. When modernizing shrimp and other fish quota allocations off Labrador's coast, the time has long passed to allocate based on solid, fair, and equitable principles. The time has come to create a distribution model on Aboriginal rights and adjacency. The time has come to make equitable allocations to inshore and offshore interests. Those next to a resource, particularly those with vested inherent Indigenous rights, must come first. Our Indigenous and rural people brought these lands into Confederation, and they occupy and hold our northern lands, making our northern and Indigenous communities economically sustainable is key to reconciliation and paramount to maintaining Arctic sovereignty. In fact, all other resource development in Labrador has been modernized to respect the rights and adjacent principles of those who live there. For example, governments and companies must have impact benefit agreements with Labrador interests and royalty sharing agreements with Labrador interests. The precedent was set for mining, for energy, and for forestry development. It is now time to establish those principles around a fishing resource. For years, Labrador's fisheries have been exploited and raped. There was never anything given back. That is not historic attachment. It was a privilege, one that equates to a legal exemption to rape a resource on the coastal doorstep of Labradorians and our Indigenous people and never have to give anything back. I will not look at this as historical attachment, but as a disrespectful act and service to our people by former governments, which has to stop. A fair and equitable shrimp allocation for Labrador interests will not greatly impact the sustainability of non-adjacent fishers, simply because as the resource retention declined, their revenues have grown immensely. But it will signal society's commitment to Indigenous people, to local people, to regional economic development, as well as a principled, evidence-based decision-making process to governance of resources. Labrador's interest in shrimp, both inshore and offshore, should be protected in Area 6. The people of Labrador should take no reductions in allocations. Based on principles of Aboriginal rights and adjacency, they fall far short on shrimp allocations compared to all others who share in that area. If you were to use the model, cuts should apply to offshore and inshore non-adjacent stakeholders in the region. This cannot be helped as science is clear on the need for conservation of the resource. It is important to protect the resource, and it is equally important to protect the people who are adjacent to do so, and to do so fairly. The principles are modern, they are smart, and the math is simple. Labrador is 100% adjacent to Area 4 and 5, and 50% adjacent in Area 6, yet holds less than 14% of the quota both inshore and offshore combined in Area 6.